In this episode of the Stories to Sleep To, you will listen to The Silent City in the Morning Mist. Section 1. The Silent City at First Light. At the edge of the forest, where the lowlands rise only slightly and the stone beneath the soil begins to show itself in scattered fragments, the wandering scribe paused before the city revealed itself fully. Dawn had not yet claimed the sky. The light was still muted, filtered through a pale veil of mist that moved slowly, almost thoughtfully, between the trees. Moisture clung to leaves and grasses, and the air carried the cool weight of night, unbroken by wind. In this half-light, the city appeared gradually, not all at once, as if it preferred to be remembered in stages rather than confronted in its entirety. The scribe did not speak. He had learned long ago that places like this responded better to patience than to words. His sandals pressed softly into soil that had not known daily footfall for centuries, though it remembered it well enough. Each step stirred a faint scent of earth and limestone. Ahead, through the thinning forest, stone forms emerged, low platforms first, then taller shapes whose edges had softened over time. The city was not ruined in the dramatic sense often imagined by those who never walked such places. It was quiet, settled into itself, neither broken nor restored, but resting. Fog drifted between structures, gathering briefly in corners before loosening and moving on. It slid along stairways worn smooth by countless bare feet, then lifted toward the upper terraces of temples whose tops were still hidden. The scribe recognized the arrangement even before he could see it clearly. A broad plaza lay ahead, its boundaries marked by long, low platforms that once supported buildings of perishable material. Wood, thatch, and woven fiber had vanished long ago, but their absence still shaped the space. The plaza felt open yet contained, designed for gathering without urgency. He stepped onto the plaza slowly, aware that he was walking across ground that had once been swept each morning. The limestone surface beneath the soil had been leveled carefully, adjusted again and again over generations. In places, shallow depressions remained where rainwater once pooled before being guided away by subtle channels. The scribe imagined hands smoothing the surface, baskets of debris carried away, the quiet routines that kept this space orderly. Maintenance here had not been a performance. It had been an expression of continuity. At the far end of the plaza, a temple rose on a stepped platform. Its stairway faced east, aligned with the direction of the rising sun, though the sun itself was still hidden behind the mist and distant trees. The scribe did not climb the steps yet. Instead, he walked the perimeter of the plaza, letting the space define itself. He passed the remains of stelae, some still upright, others leaning slightly. The carved surfaces softened but not erased. Glyphs remained visible in places, their forms deliberate and balanced, even where meaning had become difficult to read. He did not attempt to translate them immediately. That would come later, when the light was stronger. For now, he traced the outlines with his eyes, recognizing dates, titles, and names whose sounds were no longer spoken aloud. These stones had once stood freshly carved, their surfaces bright with pigment. Red, black, and blue had defined figures and symbols, making them visible from across the plaza. The color was gone now, but the intention remained. Beyond the plaza, pathways extended into clusters of structures. These were the residential compounds, arranged around smaller courtyards. The scribe moved toward one of them, stepping off the open plaza and into a more intimate space. Here, the ground was uneven, shaped by collapsed walls and the slow encroachment of vegetation. Roots wrapped around stones, holding them in place as firmly as mortar once had. The buildings were low, their foundations forming rectangles in L shapes that suggested rooms rather than monuments. He paused at the edge of one compound and imagined it as it had been. The courtyard would have been swept clean, its surface packed hard. A hearth would have burned here in the evenings, its smoke drifting upward through the open space. The smell of maize dough cooking on a griddle would have lingered in the air, mixing with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. Voices would have carried softly, not raised, as people spoke while working. Children would have moved in and out of the rooms, their footsteps light and quick. The scribe walked into what had once been a room, its walls now no more than low outlines. The space was narrow, designed for sleeping or storage rather than gathering. He imagined woven mats laid out at night, rolled away each morning. Personal objects would have been few but familiar. Gourds, stone tools, ceramic vessels painted with simple designs. Nothing here would have been extravagant. Value lay in use and reliability, not display. As he moved through the compound, the fog followed him, thinning and thickening in response to invisible currents. It gathered briefly in doorways, then dissolved. The city felt neither empty nor occupied. It existed in a state between, where memory did not intrude forcefully but was always present. The scribe felt no sense of abandonment here, only the impression of a place that had completed a long cycle and settled into rest. He returned toward the plaza, choosing a different path that led past a ball court. Its long, narrow shape was unmistakable, defined by parallel stone walls that sloped inward. The playing surface was still visible, though partially covered by leaves and soil. This space had once echoed with movement and sound, the sharp impact of rubber against stone, the measured calls of participants and spectators. The game played here had not been mere sport. It had carried ritual significance, reflecting cycles of struggle and renewal that extended beyond the court itself. The scribe stood at one end of the court and looked along its length. He imagined the players adorned with protective gear, their movements controlled and precise. The outcome of such games had sometimes been tied to ceremonies, though not always in the dramatic manner Tater stories suggested. Here, as elsewhere, mean had been layered, not singular. The court had served as both physical space and symbolic ground. From the ball court, a causeway extended toward another cluster of structures. These raised roads, known to scholars as sakbiob, had once connected different parts of the city and linked it to surrounding settlements. Their surfaces were elevated and carefully constructed, allowing travel even during the rainy season. The scribe followed one for a short distance, feeling the firmness beneath his feet. These roads had facilitated movement, exchange, and communication. They were evidence of planning that extended beyond individual households. As the fog began to lift slightly, the upper portions of the main temple came into view. The scribe turned back toward it, sensing that the moment had come to climb. He approached the stairway slowly, placing each foot carefully on the worn steps. The ascent was gradual, not steep, designed to be approached with intention rather than haste. Halfway up, he paused and looked back across the plaza. From this height, the city revealed its layout more clearly. Relationships between spaces became visible. How the open areas balanced the enclosed ones. How movement had been guided without being forced. At the top of the platform, the temple structure itself stood in partial ruin. Its doorway was narrow, leading into a dark interior. The scribe did not enter immediately. He stood at the threshold, letting his eyes adjust. Temples like this had served multiple purposes. They were places of offering, of record-keeping, of alignment with celestial events. Their interiors had once held altas, wooden lintels carved with dates and scenes, and objects now lost to time. When he stepped inside, the air felt cooler. Sound diminished further, as if absorbed by the stone. The interior chamber was small, emphasizing intimacy rather than grandeur. Here, rituals would have been conducted by a few individuals, not crowds. The scribe imagined incense smoke curling upward, its scent heavy and sweet. Words would have been spoken softly, directed not at an audience but at forces understood to be present even when unseen. He placed his hand against the stone wall, feeling its texture. The surface bore faint tool marks, evidence of careful workmanship. This temple had not been built quickly. Its construction had likely spanned years, perhaps decades, involving planning, labor coordination, and shared purpose. Each stone had been set with attention, contributing to a structure meant to endure. Outside, the fog continued to thin. Light strengthened, though the sun itself remained out of sight. Birds began to call from the surrounding forest, their sounds gentle and unhurried. The city responded subtly, not with movement but with presence. The scribe stepped back out onto the platform and sat near the edge, his legs folded beneath him. From here he could see both the monumental and the domestic, the spaces of ceremony and the spaces of daily life. He imagined a morning like this one, centuries earlier. The fog would have been the same, drifting through the plaza as people emerged from their homes. Fires would be rekindled. Water would be fetched from reservoirs carefully engineered to collect and store rainfall. Food preparation would begin quietly. The city would have awakened without spectacle, each person attending to familiar tasks. The scribe remained seated as the light continued to grow. He did not hurry. This city had waited long enough to be seen again. There was no need to rush its remembrance. For now, it was enough to sit within it, to let its shapes and silences speak in their own measured way. Section 2. The Plaza as Memory and Measure. As the light continued to strengthen, the wandering scribe descended from the temple platform and returned to the heart of the city. The plaza now revealed more of its surface, the pale limestone emerging from beneath the thinning mist. What had first appeared as an empty expanse began to show subtle variations, faint rises where stone had been repaired, shallow channels that guided rainwater, and the nearly imperceptible curves that kept the ground from cracking under heat and moisture. The plaza was not a void between important buildings. It was a carefully shaped space, one that had carried meaning through use rather than ornament. The scribe walked slowly across it, aware that this ground had once been the most shared surface in the city. Here paths converged, here announcements had been heard, disputes settled, offerings prepared, and time itself marked. The plaza had functioned as a calendar of movement, changing character depending on season, ceremony, and the rhythm of daily life. At dawn, it would have been quiet, much like it was now. Later, it would have filled gradually, never abruptly, with people passing through rather than gathering without purpose. He stopped near the center and turned in a slow circle. From this position, the city's hierarchy was visible without being imposed. The tallest structures framed the space, yet they did not dominate it completely. Temples rose at measured distances. Administrative buildings sat nearby, but not intrusively, and residential zones extended outward. Their presence implied rather than announced. This arrangement reflected a worldview in which order was maintained through balance and repetition, rather than spectacle. The scribe imagined the plaza during a period marking the turning of the agricultural cycle. Such moments had not required constant ceremony, but when ritual gatherings occurred, this space adapted to them naturally. Mats would have been laid out. Offerings of maize, cacao, and other cultivated foods would have been arranged carefully, not piled high, but placed with intention. Incense burners would have been lit, their smoke rising in steady columns before dispersing into the open air. He imagined elders standing together, their voices low and deliberate. They would have spoken not to impress, but to remind, recounting events that linked the present moment to cycles already completed many times before. The plaza had amplified sound gently, allowing speech to carry without strain. Its acoustics had been shaped by the surrounding stone, though this was not something the builders would have described in abstract terms. They had learned through experience, adjusting structures over generations until sound and space aligned. Moving toward the edge of the plaza, the scribe approached one of the long platforms that bordered it. These low constructions had supported buildings of wood and thatch, now entirely gone. He stepped up onto the platform and walked along its lengths. From here he could see the plaza from a slightly elevated perspective, enough to suggest oversight without separation. This had likely been the domain of those responsible for record-keeping, coordination of labor, or mediation between households. The scribe knelt and brushed aside a thin layer of leaves, revealing stone beneath. The surface bore faint traces of wear, patterns formed by repeated footsteps and the placement of heavy objects. He imagined scribes like himself seated here, though their role would have differed. They would have worked with bark paper books, folded and painted with care, recording dates, lineages, and events deemed important enough to preserve. These records had not been meant for casual reading. They were tools for continuity, consulted when alignment with past precedent was required. He rose and continued along the platform until he reached a stairway leading down into a smaller adjoining plaza. This secondary space felt more enclosed, defined by surrounding buildings that created a sense of inward focus. The scribe stepped down and paused, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Where the main plaza had been open and transitional, this space felt more deliberate, perhaps reserved for gatherings of specific group rather than the entire community. Here he imagined meetings held at times when decisions needed careful consideration. The architecture encouraged closeness without crowding. Voices would have remained calm, even when matters of consequence were discussed. The Maya approach to governance, as understood through surviving inscriptions and archaeological evidence, often emphasized lineage and ritual authority, rather than centralized command. Spaces like this supported such a system, allowing influence to be exercised through presence and precedent, rather than force. The scribe walked toward a building foundation at the edge of the smaller plaza. Its footprint suggested multiple rooms arranged in sequence. He entered the first, then the next, tracing the path someone else had once followed daily. Each room would have served a distinct purpose. One might have held storage vessels filled with maize or beans, sealed carefully against moisture and pests. Another could have been used for preparing pigments or maintaining tools used in ritual contexts. In one room, the scribe noticed a fragment of carved stone partially embedded in the floor. Its surface bore a simple design, geometric rather than figurative. Such fragments often marked thresholds or supported wooden elements now long gone. He imagined passing over this stone countless times. Its presence registered only subconsciously, yet contributing to a sense of order and familiarity. Leaving the building, the scribe followed a narrow passageway that led between two structures. This path had been intentionally constrained, guiding movement rather than allowing wandering. It emerged into another residential compound smaller than the one he had visited earlier. Here the courtyard was intimate, enclosed on three sides. The scribe stepped inside and stood still, letting the space speak through its proportion. He imagined a household here that differed slightly from others, perhaps in status or occupation. The courtyard would have been swept each morning, its surface marked by the placement of grinding stones used to process maize. The sound of stone against stone would have been steady and rhythmic, a familiar presence in the background of daily life. Such sounds had formed an acoustic landscape that defined the city as much as its architecture. The scribe moved toward the edge of the courtyard where a small platform suggested a raised sleeping area. At night, mats would have been unrolled, and the day's tools set aside. The boundaries between work and rest had been fluid, shaped by light rather than strict schedules. The city's inhabitants had risen with dawn and settled with dusk, their routines aligned with cycles beyond human control. As he exited the compound, the scribe noticed a slight rise in the ground leading toward a reservoir. Water management had been essential in this region where natural sources were limited. The reservoir before him was stone-lined, its edges now softened by vegetation. In its time, it would have held collected rainwater, carefully maintained to remain usable throughout the dry season. He stood at the edge and looked down into the basin. Though empty now, it retained a sense of depth and purpose. The scribe imagined people arriving here with jars, their movements unhurried. Water collection had not been a rushed activity. It was woven into the daily rhythm, a task that encouraged interaction and observation. Children would have accompanied adults, learning through repetition rather than instruction. From the reservoir, the scribe followed another path that led back toward the ceremonial core. This route passed near additional stelae, some fallen, others still upright. He stopped before one that leaned slightly, its base undermined by time. The carved surface depicted a figure standing in profile, adorned with elaborate headdress elements now difficult to distinguish. Glyphs framed the figure, their arrangement still legible even where individual signs had eroded. The scribe traced the glyphs with his eyes, identifying familiar structures, dates marking significant moments, titles indicating lineage or role, references to events that had once warranted commemoration. These inscriptions had anchored the city in time, connecting it to broader networks of power and ritual across the region. They reminded those who passed by that the city existed within a continuum larger than any single generation. He stepped back and considered the stela's placement. It stood not at the center of the plaza, but along a route of regular movement. This suggested that remembrance here had been integrated into daily life rather than isolated. People would have passed this stone often, absorbing its presence without stopping each time. Memory in this city had been cumulative rather than episodic. As the morning advanced, shafts of sunlight began to pierce the remaining mist. They illuminated sections of wall, highlighting tool marks and construction scenes. The scribe watched as light moved slowly across stone, revealing details before softening again. This interplay had been familiar to the city's builders, who aligned structures to engage with light at specific times of day and year. He imagined standing here during a solstice, observing how shadows shortened or lengthened in predictable ways. Such observations had not required abstract theory. They had been learned through careful watching, recorded in memory and material form. Architecture itself became a kind of instrument, measuring time through the movement of light. The scribe returned once more to the main plaza and sat near its edge. From here he could see the paths he had taken and those he had not yet explored. The city revealed itself gradually, offering connections rather than conclusions. Each space spoke not only of its own function, but of how it related to others, forming a network of meaning grounded in use. He remained seated as the last of the mist dissolved. The city now stood fully visible, its forms clear but not stark. It did not demand interpretation at once. Instead, it invited continued presence. For the scribe, this was enough. The city had begun to share its quiet knowledge, and there was still much more to listen to. Section 3. Doorways without doors, entering the inner rooms. With the city now fully revealed by the morning light, the wandering scribe rose from the edge of the plaza and turned his attention inward, toward the places where public life thinned and private routines once unfolded. These were the spaces not meant to impress or commemorate, but to contain the steady movement of ordinary days. The fog had retreated almost entirely, lingering only in shaded corners where stone remained cool. In its absence, the city felt closer, its distances shortened, its silences more personal. He followed a narrow path leading away from the plaza into a cluster of residential structures arranged around a series of courtyard. The transition was subtle. There was no boundary marker to announce entry into domestic space. Instead, the change was felt through scale and sound. The open resonance of the plaza faded, replaced by the softer acoustics of enclosed areas. Footsteps here would not have carried far. Voices would have remained close to the walls that held them. The scribe paused at the threshold of the first compound. Though no doors remained, the sense of entry was unmistakable. Low stone foundations outlined rooms whose walls had once risen from them in wood and plaster. These walls had been whitewashed, catching light during the day and reflecting firelight at night. Over time, rain and plant growth had erased them, but their absence did not diminish the clarity of the space they defined. He stepped inside the courtyard and stood still. The ground here was slightly lower than the surrounding platforms, shaped to collect debris that could be swept away easily. At the center, a shallow depression suggested the former presence of a hearth or working area. This courtyard would have been the heart of the household, the place where tasks overlapped and time passed without formal division. The scribe imagined a morning beginning here. Before the sun cleared the treetops, someone would have risen to rekindle the fire. Embers banked from the night before would be coaxed back into flame. The smell of smoke would have filled the courtyard briefly, then drifted upward and away. Others would have followed, rolling up sleeping mats and placing them against the walls, transforming the space from resting area to working ground. He moved toward one of the rooms opening onto the courtyard. Its floor was smooth, worn by repeated use. This room had likely served as a sleeping space, its interior kept relatively uncluttered. Storage would have been minimal, limited to personal items and objects used daily. The scribe imagined the quiet of night here, broken only by insects and distant animal calls. Within these walls, the city's larger concerns would have receded, replaced by the immediacy of rest. Stepping back into the courtyard, he crossed to another room, slightly larger and positioned to receive more light. This space would have been used for food preparation and tool maintenance. Grinding stones would have been set near the wall, their surfaces worn concave by years of processing maize. The rhythmic motion required for this work had shaped not only the stones but the bodies of those who used them, strengthening arms and establishing a tempo that carried through the day. The scribe knelt and placed his hand on the stone floor, feeling its coolness. He imagined the soundscape of this room when it was active, the steady scrape of stone, the low murmur of conversation, pauses filled by the crack of fire from the courtyard. These sounds would have blended seamlessly, forming a backdrop rather than a focal point. Life here had not been arranged around moments of intensity, but around continuity. He noticed a narrow opening at the back of the room leading to a smaller enclosed space. This area would have been used for storage, its contents protected from weather and pests. Ceramic vessels filled with dried maize, beans, and other cultivated foods would have lined the walls. Their surfaces might have been painted with simple patterns, not for display but for identification and care. The vessels themselves would have been valued for their reliability, repaired when cracked, replaced only when necessary. Leaving the compound, the scribe followed another path that wound between structures. This passage was shaded, its stones damp beneath his feet. Such paths had guided movement efficiently, connecting households without drawing attention. They allowed people to move through the city without crossing the main plaza each time, maintaining a sense of privacy within a densely populated environment. He emerged into a second courtyard, smaller than the first and more enclosed. The surrounding rooms were closely spaced, suggesting a household with many members or multiple generations living together. The scribe stood at the center and imagined the layered rhythms of life here. Children would have moved through the space unpredictably, their presence felt more than controlled. Elders would have occupied consistent positions, observing and contributing through guidance rather than constant motion. The scribe entered one of the rooms and noted a raised platform along one wall. This would have served as a sleeping or resting area, elevated slightly to remain dry and comfortable. At night, this room would have held several people, their rest synchronized by the absence of artificial light. Sleep would have come gradually, shaped by fatigue rather than schedules. He imagined evenings in this courtyard. As daylight faded, fires would have been lit again. Food prepared earlier would be shared, not ceremonially, but with quiet attentiveness. Stories might have been told, though not every night. Silence would have been equally acceptable. The city did not require constant narration to affirm its existence. Moving onward, the scribe came upon a compound that differed subtly from the others. Its courtyard was larger, its surrounding platforms more substantial. This suggested a household with a particular role within the community, perhaps one involved in coordination, teaching, or ritual preparation. The scribe entered cautiously, aware that function here would have shaped daily routines in specific ways. Within one room, he noticed the remains of a low stone bench running along the wall. Such benches had been used for seating or for supporting objects during work. The scribe imagined this room used for instruction, where younger members of the community learned through observation. Knowledge here had not been abstracted into lessons. It had been demonstrated repeatedly until it became habit. Another room opened onto the courtyard with a wider threshold, allowing easy movement. This space might have been used to receive visitors from outside the household. The scribe imagined people arriving here to discuss matters related to planting schedules, water distribution, or preparation for upcoming ceremonies. Conversations would have been measured, guided by precedent and shared understand. As the scribe moved through these spaces, he became increasingly aware of how the city balanced proximity and separation. Walls defined rooms, but they did not isolate. Courtyards gathered activity, but they did not expose it unnecessarily. This architectural rhythm reflected a social structure that valued interdependence without uniformity. He followed another path that led toward the edge of the residential zone. Here, structures became more widely spaced, their foundations partially reclaimed by vegetation. These peripheral areas had likely housed households engaged more directly with agricultural work or resource management. The scribe stepped into one such compound and noted the presence of larger storage areas, suggesting seasonal accumulation rather than daily use. From this vantage, he could see beyond the city's core toward the surrounding landscape. Fields would have extended outward, their boundaries shifting with cycles of cultivation and fallow. The city did not end abruptly at its last structures. It faded gradually into managed forest and cleared plots, its influence carried through paths and routines rather than walls. The scribe turned back toward the city and retraced his steps slowly. Each compound he passed felt distinct, shaped by the particular lives that had unfolded within it. Yet none stood apart as singular or exceptional. The city's character emerged through accumulation rather than contrast. As he returned toward the plaza, the scribe reflected on how these inner rooms had anchored the city's existence. Temples and monuments marked time and authority, but it was within these modest spaces that continuity had been sustained. Here children had learned through imitation. Here tools had been repaired rather than replaced. Here the rhythms that aligned human life with seasonal cycles had been practiced daily. He reached the edge of the plaza once more and paused, looking back toward the residential quarters. In the growing warmth of the morning, the stones held heat, releasing it slowly. The city felt awake now, though no one moved within it. For the scribe, this awakening did not signal loss. It confirmed that the city's life remained legible to those willing to move slowly enough to read it. Section 4. Stone that measures the sky. As the morning advanced and the sun finally cleared the tree line, the wandering scribe turned once more toward the tallest structures of the city. The temples, now fully illuminated, revealed details that had remained subdued in the softer light of dawn. Their stepped forms rose with deliberate rhythm, each level proportioned in relation to the others. These buildings were not only places of ceremony, they were instruments through which time, movement, and recurrence were observed and remembered. The scribe approached the primary temple again, this time circling its base rather than ascending immediately. From this perspective, the structure's relationship to the surrounding space became clearer. The stairway faced a precise direction, aligned with the path of the sun across the horizon during particular moments of the year. Such alignments were not decorative choices. They reflected careful observation carried out over generations, refined through practice rather than abstraction. He paused where the shadow of the temple fell across the plaza. The line was sharp now, no longer diffused by mist. As the sun rose higher, the shadow shortened gradually, its movements slow enough to be perceived without effort. The scribe imagined people watching this progression, not continuously, but with familiarity. They would have known where the shadow should fall at certain times, noticing deviations that signaled the turning of seasons. These observations were embedded in daily life rather than isolated in formal study. The Maya understand of time was cyclical and layered, structured through multiple calendars that tracked ritual intervals, solar years, and longer spans of historical continuity. Temples like this one served as reference points, their architecture translating celestial patterns into visible form. The scribe climbed the stairway again, this time continuing past the point where he had stopped earlier. At the top, he moved along the platform, noting how the edges framed specific views. From one corner, the horizon opened toward the east, unobstructed by nearby structures. From another, the line of sight aligned with a distant rise in the landscape. These framed perspectives were intentional, guiding attention outward as much as inward. He imagined standing here at the moment when the sun reached a particular position, its light entering the temple doorway at a precise angle. Such events marked significant points in the calendar, reinforcing connections between ritual practice and environmental cycles. These alignments did not require constant adjustment. Once established, they repeated reliably, providing continuity across generations. The scribe entered the temple chamber again, this time allowing the sunlight to illuminate its interior more fully. The stone walls bore faint traces of pigment, suggesting that surfaces here had once been painted. Colors would have added clarity to carved forms and glyphs, making them legible even in low light. Though the pigments were gone, the former presence was implied by subtle variations in the stone. He imagined a ritual conducted here at a calendrical turning points. A small group would have gathered, their movements measured. Incense would have been burned, its smoke rising and dispersing through the doorway. Spoken words would have been few, chosen carefully. The emphasis would have been on alignment rather than appeal, on marking a moment rather than altering it. Leaving the chamber, the scribe descended the steps and moved toward a secondary temple nearby. This structure was smaller, its proportions more compact. Its placement suggested a complementary function rather than a subordinate one. Smaller temples often marked specific intervals or honored particular aspects of the ritual cycle. Together, they formed a network of reference points within the city. He climbed this temple as well and stood at its summit. From here, the view differed subtly. The plaza appeared offset, and the main temple stood at an angle. This shift in perspective reinforced the idea that no single vantage point defined the city completely. Understanding emerged through movement between positions rather than fixation on one. The scribe reflected on how knowledge had been maintained here. It was not stored solely in texts or transmitted only through instruction. It was embedded in space, enacted through repeated observation. Children would have learned by accompanying elders, standing where they stood, watching what they watched. Over time, these experiences accumulated into understand. He descended again and followed a path that led behind the temples into a quieter area. Here, small structures clustered around narrow courtyard. These were spaces associated with preparation rather than performance. Ritual objects would have been stored and maintained here. Incense burners, ceramic vessels, and carved implements would have been kept in readiness. their care entrusted to those with specific responsibilities. The scribe entered one such structure and stood within its shaded interior. The air felt cooler, the light subdued. He imagined hands shaping incense pellets, mixing resins and plant material according to established recipes. These preparations were as important as the rituals themselves, ensuring consistency and continuity. He noticed a low platform against one wall, its surface smoothed by use. This might have supported bundles of bark paper or wooden elements carved with dates and symbols. Though most such materials had not survived, their absence did not erase their role. The city's record-keeping had extended beyond stone, relying on materials renewed regularly. Moving back outside, the scribe followed another route that connected the ceremonial core to the broader city. Along the way, he passed additional stelae positioned near temple approaches. These stones recorded events tied to calendrical cycles, anchoring historical memory to specific moments in time. They did not narrate continuously. Instead, they punctuated time, marking points of significance. The scribe stopped before one stela and imagined its unveiling. The stone would have been freshly carved, its surfaces crisp. Pigment would have highlighted glyphs and figures, making them legible from a distance. People would have gathered briefly, acknowledging the event recorded, then returned to their routines. Memory here was reinforced through repetition rather than spectacle. As the sun continued its ascent, the scribe noticed how the city's shadows shifted collectively. Courtyards brightened, then narrowed in shade. Doorways that had been dark earlier now admitted light. This gradual transformation guided activity naturally, signaling when certain tasks were best undertaken. He reflected on how such cues reduced the need for verbal coordination. The city's inhabitants would have understood where to be and when through shared observation. Architecture and environment worked together to structure daily life. The scribe returned to the plaza and sat once more near its center. From here, he could see temples, stelae, and pathways in relation to one another. The city presented itself not as a static arrangement, but as a sequence of moments unfolding predictably. In this way, stone had measured the sky, and the sky had given meaning to stone. The city's builders had not sought to dominate time, but to live within it attentively. For the scribe, this realization settled gently, like warmth absorbed by stone after a long morning of light. Section 5. Water held in stone and soil. By the time the sun stood clearly above the eastern horizon, the wandering scribe felt the city's attention draw outward, away from its tallest stones, and into the quieter systems that sustained it through seasons of uncertainty. He followed a gently descending path that led from the ceremonial core toward a series of reservoirs and channels, their forms subtle yet deliberate. In this land, where rivers did not reliably thread through every settlement, water had been gathered rather than assumed. Its presence here spoke of foresight practiced patiently over generations. The first reservoir lay at the edge of a broad open space, its stone-lined basin catching the light along its curved interior. The scribe approached slowly, mindful of how such structures balanced openness with containment. The edges were carefully shaped, neither too steep nor too shallow, allowing access while reducing erosion. He knelt and examined the stones that lined the basin. They were fitted with care, their joints tight enough to limit seepage yet flexible enough to withstand seasonal change. He imagined the reservoir filled after heavy rains, its surface reflecting the sky and surrounding buildings. Water would have been clear at first, then gradually clouded as daily use stirred sediment. Maintenance had been constant. Debris would have been removed regularly, algae scraped away, channels cleared. These tasks were not ceremonial, yet they carried a quiet gravity. Without water, the city could not persist through the long, dry months. The scribe traced the path of a shallow channel that guided runoff into the basin. It followed the natural slope of the land, enhanced rather than overridden by stonework. Builders here had worked with the terrain, observing how water moved during storms before deciding where to intervene. Such observation required patience across seasons, and attentiveness that extended beyond a single lifetime. He followed the channel backward, toward its source near the plaza. Along the way, he noticed small depressions and secondary channels branching off, each serving a specific purpose. Some diverted excess water away from foundations, Others slowed flow, reducing erosion. The system was distributed rather than centralized, resilient through redundancy. The scribe paused where a channel passed near a residential compound. Here, access to water would have shaped daily routines. People would have arrived with jars at regular intervals, their movements unhurried. Water collection had been woven into social interaction, offering moments of shared presence without formal gathering. Children would have learned the weight of full vessels through experience, adjusting their grip and posture gradually. He imagined a morning scene here. The sun would still be low, the air cool. Conversation would be sparse, not from solemnity but from familiarity. Everyone knew what to do. The sound of water poured carefully into containers would have punctuated the quiet, followed by footsteps returning along shaded paths. Moving onward, the scribe reached a second reservoir, smaller than the first and more enclosed. This basin served a specific cluster of households. Its capacity matched to their needs. Its placement reduced travel distance, minimizing strain during the dry season when water levels fell. Such localized planning reflected an understanding of scale that extended beyond monumental architecture. The scribe looked into the basin and imagined its surface lowering slowly over weeks without rain. The city's inhabitants would have monitored this change closely, adjusting usage without panic. Practices of conservation were embedded in routine rather than enforced through decree. Water was respected not as a commodity, but as a presence requiring care. Beyond the reservoirs, the path continued toward the outskirts of the city, where managed forest and cultivated land met. The scribe followed it, feeling the ground soften underfoot as stone gave way to soil. Here, the city's boundaries blurred, structures thinned, replaced by terraces and cleared plots shaped subtly to retain moisture and prevent runoff. He stopped at the edge of a field, its surface uneven with the remains of planting mounds. Though long overgrown, their pattern was still discernible. These fields had been part of a milpa system, rotated over time to maintain soil fertility. Maize, beans, and squash would have been cultivated together, their growth supporting one another. Such practices reflected deep ecological knowledge accumulated through observation and adaptation. The scribe imagined farmers arriving here at dawn, carrying tools worn smooth by use. Their work would have been steady rather than hurried. Guided by seasonal rhythms, planting followed the rains, harvest anticipated their retreat. The success of these fields depended as much on timing as on effort. He knelt and pressed his hand into the soil. It was loose, rich with organic matter built up over years of careful management. This fertility had not been accidental. It was the result of allowing land to rest, of resisting the urge to extract continuously. The city's survival depended on restraint practiced collectively. From the field's edge, the scribe could see paths leading back toward the residential zones. These routes connected households directly to their cultivated plots, reducing reliance on centralized storage. Food moved along familiar paths, its journey short and predictable. This proximity reinforced accountability and awareness. The scribe followed one such path back toward the city, passing a small structure near the field's boundary. Its foundation suggested a shelter rather than a residence. Such buildings were used to store tools or provide shade during work. They marked the transition between cultivated and domestic space, acknowledging the distinct rhythms of each. As he re-entered the city proper, the scribe noticed how vegetation had been managed even within urban boundaries. Trees provided shade without undermining structures. Useful plants grew near households, their placement intentional. The city was not an imposition on the landscape, but a negotiation with it. He returned toward the reservoirs once more, this time observing how paths converged there from multiple directions. Water had shaped movement just as plaza had shaped gathering. Its presence drew people outward and inward in daily cycles, reinforcing connection through necessity. The scribe sat near the edge of the largest basin and watched light ripple across its stone lining. Even empty, the reservoir retained its form, its purpose legible. He reflected on how such systems required collective trust. Each household depended on others to maintain channels, respect usage norms, and respond to change without excess. This trust was not enforced through constant oversight. It was cultivated through shared experience, reinforced by observation of consequences over time. When rains failed or arrived late, adjustments were made collectively. The city's resilience lay in its capacity to adapt without abandoning established patterns. As the sun climbed higher, the air warmed. The scribe rose and followed a shaded path back toward the ceremonial core. He carried with him a deeper sense of how the city had sustained itself not through abundance alone, but through attentiveness practiced daily. Water here had been held in stone and soil, guided patiently, shared carefully. Its management reflected values as clearly as any monument. For the scribe, this understanding settled quietly, another layer added to the city's unfolding story. Section 6. The quiet labor of sound and stillness. As the sun moved higher and the warmth of the day settled across stone and soil, the wandering scribe became aware of how sound would have once filled the city without overwhelming it. Though the city now lay silent, its design suggested an acoustic life shaped carefully through habit rather than control. Sound here had been functional, grounding daily labor in rhythm and expectation, while silence had provided space for rest and reflection. The scribe stood near the edge of a residential compound and closed his eyes briefly, imagining the city as it would have been during an ordinary day. The first sounds would not have been voices, but movements. Sandals brushing against packed earth, the soft thud of jars set down, the scrape of wood against stone as doors were moved aside. These sounds would have emerged gradually, overlapping without competing. He walked slowly along a path that ran between several compounds, noting how the walls and vegetation softened echoes. The city's layout absorbed sound rather than amplifying it. Narrow passages limited the distance voices could travel, encouraging conversation at close range. Courtyards opened selectively, allowing sound to disperse upward rather than outward. This design reduced the need for raised voices, shaping social interaction through architecture. The scribe paused near a courtyard where the remains of grinding stones lay partially exposed. He imagined the steady rhythm of maize being processed, stone against stone, a sound both continuous and subdued. This work would have occupied many hours, its tempo unchanging. The repetition did not dull attention, it anchored it. Over time, the sound became part of the city's background, marking the passage of hours without demanding notice. Nearby, he imagined other tasks unfolding in parallel. Fibers being twisted into cord, wooden implements being smoothed with stone tools, ceramic vessels being cleaned and prepared for reuse. Each activity contributed its own subtle sound, layering without clashing. Together they formed a soundscape defined by balance rather than intensity. The scribe moved toward a shaded area beneath a tree planted deliberately near a cluster of homes. Such trees provided not only relief from heat but also a gathering point for quieter tasks. Here he imagined elders seated, working with their hands while observing the movement around them. Their guidance would have been offered sparingly, often through gesture rather than speech. Knowledge here was conveyed through proximity and repetition. He considered how silence functioned within this environment. It was not enforced or revered as an absence, but accepted as a natural interval. Pauses in conversation did not require filling. Moments of stillness occurred between tasks, allowing attention to reset. The city's rhythm accommodated these pauses, recognizing them as necessary rather than idle. The scribe followed a path leading toward the city's edge, where agricultural work would have produced a different acoustic pattern. Here sounds were more dispersed. The rustle of leaves, the dull impact of tools striking soil, the occasional call exchanged across distance. These sounds carried farther, shaped by open space rather than stone walls. He imagined farmers working in small group, their movements coordinated without constant communication. Familiarity reduced the need for instruction. The land itself guided action, its condition read through touch and sight. When speech occurred, it was brief and specific, oriented toward immediate needs. Returning toward the city's interior, the scribe noticed how the transition between these soundscapes was gradual. There was no abrupt shift from field to household. Instead, sounds blended and faded, creating continuity. This seamless transition reflected a social structure that did not sharply divide labor types but integrated them. The scribe entered a compound where a larger courtyard suggested communal activity. Here he imagined periods of shared work, such as preparing materials for construction or organizing goods for storage. During such times, sound would have increased but remained controlled. Coordination relied on shared understand rather than shouted commands. He imagined laughter occurring occasionally, brief and contained. Joy here was not performed loudly. It emerged naturally, then settled back into the prevailing calm. The city's soundscape allowed for such moments without letting them dominate. The scribe reflected on how ritual altered sound differently. During ceremonies, silence would have deepened rather than disappeared. Movements became more deliberate. Spoken words were fewer, the weight increased by restraint. Instruments, when used, produced tones chosen for clarity rather than volume. These sounds marked transitions rather than sustaining attention continuance. He moved toward the ceremonial core again, standing near the base of a temple. From here, he imagined the contrast between ritual sound and daily noise. The city accommodated both without confusion, its spaces guiding behavior subtly. The scribe sat on a low stone and listened to the present silence. It was not empty. Insects moved through grass. Birds called intermittently from the forest's edge. Wind passed lightly through leaves. These sounds connected the city to its surroundings, reminding its inhabitants of rhythms beyond human design. He considered how such an environment shaped attention. Without constant stimulation, awareness expanded outward. People learned to notice small changes, a shift in wind direction, a difference in light, an unfamiliar sound signaling something out of place. This attentiveness supported resilience, allowing the city to respond to change without panic. The scribe rose and walked once more through the residential paths, feeling the warmth of stone beneath his feet. He imagined the city in the late afternoon, sounds diminishing as work concluded. Fires would be prepared again, voices would soften. The day would close gradually, without announcement. As evening approached in his imagination, silence would deepen, punctuated only by essential movement. This quiet did not signify emptiness, it marked completion. The city rested within it, gathering energy for the cycle to begin again. For the wandering scribe, this understanding of sound and stillness revealed another layer of the city's lives. Its endurance had depended not only on structures and systems, but on an acoustic balance that supported focus, cooperation, and rest. In this balance, the city had found its rhythm, steady and sustaining across generations. Section 7. Objects that remember the hand. With the day now fully established, the wandering scribe turned his attention to the crafted things that had once filled the city's rooms and courtyards. These objects, modest in scale and quiet in presence, carried the imprint of repeated use. They did not announce their importance, yet they had sustained the city's routines. Through them, labor had been translated into form, and knowledge preserved without words. He entered a shaded structure near the residential core where the floor remained cool even as the sun warmed the stones outside. The space suggested storage and preparation rather than dwelling. Along the walls, low platforms hinted at shelves once holding ceramic vessels. The scribe imagined jars of varying sizes, their surfaces burnished smooth. Some would have held water, others grains or prepared foods. Each vessel's shape reflected its purpose, refined through generations of use. He imagined lifting one such jar, feeling its weight balanced carefully between thickness and capacity. The clay would have been sourced locally, mixed and tempered to prevent cracking. Firing required attention and patience. The heat managed to harden without deforming. These processes were learned through repetition rather than instruction, each potter refining technique incrementally. The scribe moved to another room where the remains of stone tools lay scattered, half buried. He knelt and examined a blade fragment, its edge dulled but still purposeful. Such tools had been resharpened repeatedly, their forms evolving as material wore away. A tool's lifespan was measured not in novelty, but in adaptability. Repair extended usefulness, reinforcing a culture of care rather than replacement. He imagined a work area where tools were maintained at the end of each day. Grinding surfaces would have been cleared of residue, wooden handles tightened or replaced. This attention ensured readiness, reducing uncertainty. The city's stability depended on such quiet acts performed consistently. The scribe followed a path toward a compound that appeared to have housed specialized activity. Its rooms were arranged to allow light from one direction, suggesting tasks that required visibility without exposure. Here, he imagined the preparation of ritual objects. Incense burners would have been cleaned carefully, their interiors scraped free of residue. Carved elements would have been inspected for damage, repaired where possible. He imagined bark paper sheets laid out to dry, their surfaces smoothed and prepared for painting. Such materials did not endure across centuries, yet their influence shaped how information was recorded and remembered. Dates, names, and events were preserved temporarily, renewed as needed. This impermanence did not weaken memory, it required engagement. Moving onward, the scribe entered a courtyard where weaving tools might once have been used. Posts embedded in the ground suggested frames for textiles. He imagined fibers being drawn tight, their tension adjusted through feel rather than measurement. Patterns emerged gradually, guided by tradition and variation. Textiles here served functional needs, but they also carried meaning through color and arrangement. He reflected on how these objects structured time. A vessel filled and emptied daily marked routine. A tool repaired seasonally reflected cycles of work. Ritual items prepared for specific moments anchored the calendar. Together, they formed a material rhythm that complemented architectural and environmental cues. The scribe noticed a small stone bench near the edge of the courtyard. Its surface was polished from use. He sat briefly, imagining the pause it once offered to someone mid-task. Such benches provided rest without disengagement, allowing work to resume smoothly. The city accommodated fatigue without stigmatizing it. He followed another path leading toward the ceremonial area, where larger objects would have been used. Stone altars stood low and broad, their surfaces worn. These had supported offerings rather than displays. Food, incense, and symbolic items would have been placed here, arranged carefully and removed afterward. Nothing was left indefinitely. Ritual here emphasized renewal over accumulation. The scribe examined the base of an altar and noted shallow grooves worn into the stone. These marks testified to repeated placement, hands setting objects down in familiar positions. Such repetition built precision without rigidity. Each act reinforced memory through motion. Nearby, he imagined wooden elements now lost. Lintels carved with dates, poles used in processions, containers for ceremonial tools. Their absence did not erase the significance. It emphasized the role of renewal. Materials were replaced as they wore out, maintaining continuity through effort. The scribe reflected on how ownership functioned within this material culture. Objects were personal without being isolated. Tools belonged to households, yet their use supported the community. Ritual items were entrusted to caretakers rather than possessed. This distribution reduced accumulation while preserving responsibility. He returned toward the residential areas and entered a room where daily objects would have been kept close at hand. He imagined gourds for carrying liquids, simple ornaments worn without emphasis, bundles of cord prepared for repair. These items accompanied people through their routines, unnoticed until needed. The scribe considered how such objects shaped identity subtly. Familiar weight in the hand, a known texture beneath fingers, reinforced belonging. People recognized their place within the city not through titles alone, but through participation in shared material practices. As the afternoon light angled across the city, shadows lengthened. Objects once again shifted in appearance, their surfaces catching light differently. The scribe watched as stone darkened in shade, pottery warmed in sun. These changes marked time without words. He rose and walked slowly back toward the plaza, carrying with him an appreciation for the city's crafted things. Through them, memory had been held lightly yet persistently. Hands shaped objects, objects guided hands, and through this exchange, the city endured. For the wandering scribe, this understand added another quiet dimension. The city was not only built of stone and shaped by water and sound. It was sustained through things made, used, repaired, and renewed. In these objects, the past remained close, waiting to be recognized through touch and cared. Section 8. When the city turns toward rest. As the afternoon advanced, the wandering scribe sensed a gradual easing in the city's imagined tempo. Light no longer fell directly from above, but angled gently, softening the contrast between stone and shadow. The city responded to this change without effort. Walls absorbed warmth and released it slowly. Courtyards shifted in character, becoming places of pause rather than labor. The scribe followed this transition attentively, aware that rest here had once been structured as carefully as work. He walked along a familiar residential path and noticed how doorways framed the changing light. Interiors that had been bright earlier now held shadow, inviting retreat. The scribe imagined people stepping inside not out of fatigue alone, but in response to a shared understand of timing. Afternoon was not a continuation of morning effort. It marked a turning, a recognition that energy needed to be gathered again. He entered a courtyard where the grinding stones lay quiet. Their surfaces still held warmth, but no hands moved over them now. This pause did not suggest neglect. It reflected completion. Tasks begun earlier had reached a natural stopping point. The scribe imagined food already prepared, vessels cleaned, tools set aside deliberately rather than dropped. In one corner of the courtyard, he imagined someone seated on a low bench, back against the wall, eyes half closed. Rest here was not sleep. It was a state of watchful ease. The sounds of the city softened, punctuated by distant activity rather than nearby motion. Such moments allowed attention to drift without fully disengaging. The scribe moved toward a shaded structure whose interior felt cooler than the open air. These spaces had served as retreats during the hottest hours. Within them, conversation would have been minimal. People might have shared the space without interacting directly, each attending to their own thoughts while remaining aware of others. He imagined children lying on woven mats, their movements slowing as heat encouraged stillness. Elders would have occupied places of comfort, their presence steady. Stories, if told, would have been brief, familiar, requiring no effort to follow. Often, silence would have sufficed. The scribe reflected on how rest was integrated into daily rhythm rather than postponed. The city's design supported this integration. Narrow passages created shade. Trees were positioned to break direct sunlight. Building orientation reduced heat buildup. These choices reflected an understanding that endurance depended on moderation. He followed a path leading toward the ceremonial core once more, observing how the plaza now appeared less expansive. Light traced its edges rather than filling it. The scribe imagined fewer people crossing it at this hour. Those who did would have moved slowly, their steps unhurried. There was no expectation of urgency. Near the base of a temple, the scribe sat briefly on a stone step. From here, he could see across the city, noting how activity clustered in shaded areas. The city did not shut down. It redistributed itself. Life continued in pockets, connected by paths that required little effort to navigate. He imagined ritual practitioners using this time for quiet preparation. Objects would be checked and arranged for evening use. Incense resins sorted, vessels filled. These tasks required focus but not haste. The afternoon provided a buffer between outward labor and inward attention. The scribe considered how the body learned this rhythm through repetition. Over years, people would have internalized cues of light, temperature, and sound. Rest did not need to be announced, it was felt. He returned to a residential compound and stood at its entrance, watching light move across the courtyard. Shadows lengthened, connecting structures visually. The city appeared to draw itself together, becoming more cohesive as distinctions softened. He imagined conversations resuming quietly as the heat eased. People would speak of ordinary matters, review the day's work, make small plans for the evening. These exchanges reinforced connection without demanding resolution. The city's continuity depended on such low-intensity communication. The scribe followed a path toward the outskirts, where the transition from city to managed forest became visible again. Here the air felt cooler, carrying scents of leaves and soil. The work of the day had already retreated from these spaces. They awaited evening movement. As the sun dipped lower, the scribe felt the city's attention shift inward once more. Fires would soon be prepared, food shared. The day would close gradually, without ceremony. This closing did not mark an ending, but a folding inward, preparing for renewal. He returned to the plaza one last time during this imagined afternoon and stood quietly. The city, now bathed in softened light, held a different kind of presence. It invited stillness without emptiness. For the wandering scribe, this period of rest revealed the city's restraint. Energy was not expended continuously. It was gathered, released, and gathered again. In this pattern, the city sustained itself not through force, but through balance learned patiently over time. Section 9. Evening, shared food, and the softening of time. As the sun lowered toward the western horizon, the wandering scribe sensed the city preparing for a different kind of togetherness. The air cooled gradually, releasing the warmth held in stone and soil. Shadows stretched and joined, smoothing edges that had been sharp earlier. The city did not announce evening. It allowed it. He walked along a residential path and imagined the first signs of this transition. Fires would be tended again, embers stirred and coaxed into flame. The scent of smoke would rise gently, not thick enough to obscure, but present enough to mark change. These fires were not solely for cooking. They were points of orientation, drawing people inward after a day spent dispersed. The scribe paused at the entrance to a courtyard and imagined food being brought out, not all at once, but in stages. Vessels would be set down carefully. Prepared maize dishes would be portioned without ceremony. Sharing here was habitual rather than symbolic. Everyone knew where to sit, how much to take, when to wait. He imagined people gathering along the edges of the courtyard, backs against walls still warm from the day. Conversation would begin quietly, often with simple observations. The day's work would be reviewed not as achievement, but as completion. Tasks finished, tools repaired, fields tended. These acknowledgments required little elaboration. Children would have settled near familiar adults, their movements slowing as light faded. Elders would have occupied positions of comfort, their presence grounding. Food would have been eaten attentively, but without haste. This was a time for replenishment rather than display. The scribe considered how such meals reinforced social bonds through repetition. No single evening defined community. It was the accumulation of these moments, nearly indistinguishable from one another, that sustained it. Disagreements, when they occurred, were not addressed here. Evening favored continuity. He moved toward another compound and imagined a slightly different gathering. Some households would have been smaller, others larger. The arrangement of people would have reflected relationships shaped over years. Seating was informal but consistent. Everyone knew where they belonged. As the light continued to fade, the scribe imagined lamps being lit within rooms. Their glow would have been soft, contained. Shadows danced along walls, animating surfaces without overwhelming them. Inside, conversations might have continued briefly before settling into quiet. He followed a path toward the plaza and imagined fewer people crossing it now. Those who did moved purposefully, heading toward specific destinations. The plaza's openness at this hour emphasized its stillness. It was no longer a place of movement, but of presence. Near the base of the temple, the scribe imagined a small group gathering for a modest ritual marking the close of the day. Such practices did not occur nightly, but when they did, they were restrained. Incense might be burned. A few words spoken. The emphasis remained on acknowledgement rather than appealed. He reflected on how time softened in the evening. Distinctions between moments blurred. The pressure of sequence eased. People allowed themselves to drift slightly, guided by habit rather than intention. This easing supported rest without forcing it. The scribe returned to a residential compound and stood at its threshold, imagining the courtyard now dim. Fires burned lower. Voices softened further. The city's soundscape narrowed, focusing on nearby presence rather than distant activity. He imagined someone repairing a small object by firelight, hands moving slowly. Others might have watched without comment, their attention relaxed. Such shared quiet reinforced trust without requiring explanation. As darkness approached fully, the scribe imagined doors being closed, not to exclude but to contain. Sleeping spaces were prepared. Mats unrolled. The city gathered itself inward. He walked once more toward the edge of the city, where the forest pressed close. Here evening sounds emerged more clearly. Insects began their steady calls. The city listened without responding. It was part of the same cycle. The scribe reflected on how night did not arrive suddenly here. It emerged gradually, invited by the setting sun, and accepted without resistance. This acceptance shaped the city's endurance. Nothing was forced beyond its moment. He returned toward the center and sat near the plaza's edge, imagining the city now mostly still. A few lights glimmered within rooms. Fires burned low. Movement was minimal. In this quiet, the scribe sensed how the city held memory gently. Evening gatherings did not recount history formally. They reinforced it through presence. Each shared meal, each familiar arrangement of bodies and objects, reaffirmed continuity. For the wandering scribe, this transition into night revealed another dimension of the city's design. Time here was allowed to soften, to release its grip. In doing so, the city prepared itself for rest, ensuring that when morning returned, it would be received without strain. Section 10. Nightfall and the return to stillness. As the last light faded from the horizon, the wandering scribe sensed the city completing its daily arc. Darkness did not descend abruptly. It settled gradually, deepening first in shaded courtyard, then along paths, and finally across the open plaza. The sky above dimmed from pale blue to deep indigo, and the first stars appeared, steady and unhurried. The city received night as it had received every other change throughout the day, without resistance. The scribe walked slowly through the residential quarters one final time, imagining how households prepared for sleep. Fires were allowed to burn down to embers, their glow contained. The warmth they provided lingered, enough to ease the cool that followed sunset. Doors were closed gently, not barred. Night here was familiar, not threatening. Inside the imagined rooms, mats were unrolled again, laid out with practiced motions. Personal items were placed within reach, arranged consistently. These small rituals of preparation required no instruction. They were learned early, reinforced nightly, shaping a sense of security through repetition. The scribe imagined families settling into sleep together, bodies aligned to maximize comfort within limited space. Conversation, if it occurred at all, was brief. Words were unnecessary. The city's sounds narrowed to those of breathing, shifting weight, and the occasional crack of cooling embers. Outside, the city's architecture guided darkness as it had guided light. Narrow passages limited the spread of sound. Courtyard held pockets of night air. Trees along the city's edges filtered starlight, their silhouettes steady against the sky. The city did not seek to banish darkness. It accommodated it. The scribe moved toward the ceremonial core, where the temples now stood in silhouette. Their forms were still legible against the sky, though details had softened. These structures, which measured time during the day, now marked stillness, their presence reassured without asserting. He imagined a night when a ritual coincided with this hour. Such events were rare and deliberate. Torches would have been lit, their flames controlled. Movement would have been slow, sound minimal. The night heightened attention, encouraging restraint. Most nights, however, passed without ceremony. The city rested. This rest was not an absence of life, but a different mode of it. Dreams unfolded within sleeping bodies, shaped by the day's experiences. These dreams were not dismissed. They were considered part of the cycle, another space where memory and meaning circulated. The scribe paused near the edge of the plaza and looked upward. The stars formed patterns long observed and remembered. Their movement across the sky reinforced the city's understanding of continuity beyond the span of any single life. Night connected the city to a wider order, one that did not require interpretation to be felt. He imagined elders waking briefly during the night, listening to familiar sounds, then returning to sleep. Such awakenings were not disturbances. They were acknowledgments of presence. The city held its inhabitants even as they drifted between waking and rest. The scribe followed a path toward the city's boundary, where forest sounds grew more pronounced. Insects called steadily. Distant animals moved. These sounds blended with the city's own quiet, forming a continuous field rather than a contrast. The city and the surrounding land rested together. He returned once more to the center and sat on a low stone near the plaza's edge. In the darkness, the city felt neither diminished nor absent. It was complete. The cycles that sustained it had reached their quietest point, preparing for renewal. The scribe reflected on how night preserved balance. By yielding to darkness, the city conserved energy. It allowed stone to cool, bodies to rest, and attention to soften. This yielding was essential to endurance. As the hours passed in his imagination, the city remained still. Nothing demanded attention. Nothing needed to be adjusted. This trust in continuity had allowed generations to sleep without fear, confident that morning would return. For the wandering scribe, night revealed the city's final lesson of the day. Rest was not a pause between meaningful moments. It was itself a form of participation, a necessary part of the cycle that sustained both people and place. In this shared stillness, the city endured, waiting quietly for the first light to arrive again. Section 11. The city that continues. Before the first hint of dawn returned to the horizon, the wandering scribe sensed the city beginning its quiet preparation for another cycle. Nothing moved yet. No sound marked the shift. And yet, the stillness carried a subtle expectancy, as though the city itself remembered what came next. Night had not ended, but it had reached its deepest point, the moment from which light would slowly emerge. The scribe stood near the edge of the plaza, where stone retained the cool of darkness. Above him, the stars remained visible, their arrangement unchanged from the hours before. These patterns had been observed for generations, not as distant abstractions, but as companions to daily life. The city's builders had aligned stone with sky, allowing architecture and cosmos to converse without words. He imagined the first stirrings within the residential quarters. Someone would awaken briefly, adjusting a mat, listening to familiar sounds. Breathing deepened again. Sleep continued. These small movements marked the threshold between rest and waking, a gentle overlap rather than a sharp division. As time passed, the sky began to lighten almost imperceptibly. Darkness softened, releasing its hold without resistance. The city responded subtly. Stone surfaces shifted in tone. Shadows loosened the edges. The wandering scribe felt the change more than he saw it, an easing that signaled continuity rather than interruption. He walked slowly through the paths he had traveled the day before, retracing them now in reverge. The residential compounds lay quiet, their forms held gently in half-light. Doorways without doors framed the coming day, their openings neither closed nor exposed. These spaces awaited use without urgency. The scribe imagined fires being prepared once more. Embers saved through the night would be coaxed into flame, smoke rising briefly before dispersing. This act connected days without beginning anew. Continuity here depended on carrying forward what remained rather than starting from nothing. He returned to the plaza as the first light touched its surface. The limestone reflected softly, revealing familiar contours. The space did not need to be reclaimed. It had held its purpose through the night. Soon it would guide movement again, receiving footsteps without judgment. The scribe imagined the city waking gradually, each household following its own rhythm while remaining aligned with the whole. There was no signal to begin. Light itself provided the cue. This reliance on shared observation reduced friction, allowing life to unfold without command. He considered how the city's endurance had depended on such design. Architecture guided behavior without force. Systems supported daily needs without excess. Ritual marked time without overwhelming it. Together, these elements created a place capable of sustaining attention across generations. The scribe moved toward the temple platform one final time and climbed its steps as dawn strengthened. From the summit, he looked out across the city, now visible in full clarity once again. The cycle had completed itself. Morning had returned, indistinguishable yet essential. He imagined people emerging from their homes, not yet speaking, carrying vessels, adjusting tools. The city resumed its life without requiring remembrance of its past each day. Memory was embedded in routine, reinforced through action rather than recollection. The wandering scribe understood then that the city's silence was not absence, it was preservation. Even in abandonment, the city continued to offer its knowledge to those willing to move slowly enough to perceive it. As the light settled fully across stone and soil, the scribe prepared to leave. He did not feel that he was departing from something finished. The city would continue, with or without him, held in its rhythms and forms. For those who listen to stories like this one, the city offers an invitation rather than a conclusion. To imagine these quiet cycles is to step briefly into a different measure of time, one shaped by balance, attention, and rest. As you allow this story to settle, and as the city returns to its gentle stillness within your thoughts, you are invited to continue this journey in future explorations. If this quiet walk through the morning mist has brought calm or curiosity, consider supporting the channel by liking the video and subscribing, so more gentle histories can unfold here, night after night. This is the end of the story. Up from here, I will continue with Jungle Rain. I hope you like the story. If you do so, please like and subscribe to my channel.